Hey guys, and welcome to this episode of the Dragonstone podcast. Today we're joined by my friend Tonja Vernazza. Tonja knows a thing or two about saints, so we decided to record an episode where Tonja shares her experiences and her approaches to working with saints as part of a well-rounded magical diet, I suppose you could say. Tonja's a good friend of mine, and I wanted to just take a little moment at the start of the show to talk about ways in which community matters for occult practitioners. I met Tonja through Rune Soup, which is a podcast and magical community run by Gordon White. There'll be a link to that in the show notes for you to check it out. And Tonja's part of a big community of people that I've met and developed really deep and valuable friendships with. There have been professional collaborations as a result of that particular community. There have been personal collaborations as well in terms of just the way in which friendship and collegiality can develop amongst practitioners of any sort of discipline, but in particular, magical and spiritual disciplines. It's a really beautiful thing, and I'm really delighted to share Tonja's story with you, and I'm also delighted over the next few episodes to share the stories and the experiences of people that I know through these communities. In general, it's really important to find community. In most spiritual traditions, the emphasis on the importance of community and your associates in terms of your development spiritually is really firmly emphasized, and there is a reason for that. So this is just one of the many little gems that I'm really privileged to be able to share with you when it comes to Tonja's story and the wisdom and expertise she's able to share in this instance about saints. So without any further ado, I'll throw to the interview and we'll get started. Before we do, a bit of shameless self-promotion. I'll be linking to all of Tonja's websites and various social presences in the show notes. But, also my books are open, so check out dragonstoneastrology.com, book in for a reading, buy a talisman. Just check it out. It's a nice place to be. Okay, now seriously on to the interview. All right. We've got to sort of introduce things first, because otherwise
Absolutely.
We're just going to get into these really fascinating anecdotes. Tonja. Okay, so today, guys, I'm joined by Tonja Vernazza. Tonja is a good friend of mine and is an excellent resource for saint law and saint praxis. I'd regard her as an expert when it comes to these matters, and very much more educated in and experienced than myself. So we've got Tonja here today to help us understand a bit more about saints and understand a little bit more about the way in which saint praxis and saint work can figure into a fuller and richer magical life and experience. So welcome, Tonja. It's nice to talk to you face to face.
Thank you. It's fun. This is going to be fun. I love this topic, and it's something that has become over the past few years just a huge part of my personal praxis. And there are a lot of saints in the spirit team. So yeah, they just have seemed to, I don't know, I kind of just, they arrive and it's just kind of like, cool, let's be friends. I guess the first thing to know about me is that I was not born Catholic. I was not raised Catholic. I wasn't really raised anything. I come from what I call California non-denominational heathen, and not heathen in the sense of Norse magical practice, but heathen in the sense that I come from a long line of farmers. And so we were always living in rural areas. And actually my ancestry for the last, 450 years has been Quakers. So my ancestors were a little side-eye when I converted to Catholicism in my 20s. And that was sort of a long story.
Well, I'm wondering whether the saint work was there before the conversion to Catholicism or whether it's something that naturally followed, having access to this big register of the very special dead.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's like, people talk about other people who they think of as being particularly nice or generous, who, volunteer for causes such as helping homeless people or helping feed the poor or, non-violent demonstrations or visiting people in prison as being saintly. But there are lots of saints who were not particularly nice people when they were in a human body. Oh, and I shouldn't say human because there are plenty of saints who are not human.
Tell us more about that.
Well, the archangels are considered saints, for instance.
Of course, yeah.
So you've got, Saint Michael, the archangel. You've got Saint Gabriel, the archangel. You've got Saint Raphael, the archangel. And they share a feast day, September 29th. And then, you have my favorite, well, one of my favorites is Saint Guinefor, who is a dog. And there's actually a really cute story about him or how he became to be a saint. But really it's very adjacent to ancestor practice because most saints were human and now they're since passed. And so really the criteria for beatification and canonization by the Roman Church is that they, number one, have to be dead. And number two, they have to have at least 2 miracles, verified post-death. And then they can be considered for the process to make them an official saint. But there's plenty of folk saints too that just have, this kind of groundswell of devotion. Like I'm thinking of Santa Muerta. Like the church doesn't recognize Holy Death as an actual saint. And there's plenty of, in the kind of Espiritismo or Curandismo, like sort of the Latin American traditions, there's plenty of folk saints. There's doctors and gamblers and it's kind of, it gets into this really interesting overlap with people who practice hoodoo will be familiar with them, or any of the African traditions. They will show up in those spaces too.
Well, I suppose you've got a divide, right? Because the process for beatification is intensely bureaucratic and has this strange overlay between a bureaucracy that will then, rubber stamp someone as a saint, and then by virtue of, I don't remember what the technical term is, but there's a compact between the Pope and God, and whatever the Pope says on earth as canon law, God will hold true in heaven. And so once the Pope rubber stamps a dead person as a saint, that's it. They're just part of that kind of spiritual hierarchy on the other side. And then you've got folk praxis with Santa Muerte. I'm also thinking of when the Ukraine-Russia conflict broke out, there was this kind of apparition, not so much in physical terms, but St. Javelin kind of rose up to the consciousness, and there was a little bit of devotional, the very beginnings of devotional condensation around this alleged saint, which is hilarious when you think about it. I mean, obviously not because of the situation.
Oh, sure.
But, it's...
Because that strikes me as very, chaos magic.
Yeah.
Almost like the Discordians. I mean, there's this little bit of tongue-in-cheek kind of, I don't know. It's, this is not your auntie and grandma's Catholicism saint work. That gets into something a little more fun and slightly irreverent, I think.
I'm kind of wondering about the origins of Santa Muerte, because Santa Muerte didn't have a body. St. Javelin's obviously just an idea that people are kind of cohering around. But I'm wondering whether that particular praxis, not to compare them on too deep a level, but, Santa Muerte would have emerged into someone's consciousness at some point, or would have made her presence known, and then people would have begun a praxis around her in terms of folk praxis and folk saint work. That's kind of how it kicks off, isn't it? Or am I completely off the mark?
I mean, I have introduced myself to her, but I don't have I don't have nearly as strong a relationship with her. I mean, I'm acquainted with her, put it that way. What little I've heard and read about her, I believe her devotion started with some people who are either adjacent to or within some of the gangs and drug cartels and things in Mexico. But that's about all I know about her origin story. And even then, I kind of give that some side eye because that sounds very pearl clutchy to me. I'm sure that she must have either come to somebody in a dream or has performed miracles and favors for people who have given her devotion. I've also read, and I can't remember the name of the Mayan or Aztec goddess that she's also syncretized to. But that particular pantheon and culture is completely opaque to me. I know very little about it.
Well, from my perspective, I know very little about saints in general. So I defer to your expertise. But one of the things that gets me, though, with Santa Muerte, for instance, and the syncretization with goddesses in different pantheons and gods in different pantheons that tend to put on Catholic robes when they're canonized. I'm thinking also of St. Bridget as well.
Yes.
And
I was just thinking of St. Bridget, too, when you said that.
I often think of St. Bridget. I like her as a saint. She's cool.
Oh, yeah. And then I've heard, I find that many things are true at the same time, even though they seem to contradict one another, because, at least in my opinion, you kind of have to look at this stuff through a mythological lens. And especially since, Celts, that's a horrible umbrella shorthand for the peoples of the islands that are now considered like the UK. And then also parts of France, because they didn't write stuff down on parchment or carve things into stone the way other ancient cultures have. We don't really know for sure what Bridget's, the goddess Bridget, what her role was, or what her devotees practiced, or how they worshipped her, or anything like that. All we have is kind of like oral tradition. And, and that becomes like playing telephone, right? It's like it passes from one person to another and the story gets embellished, it gets changed. And so neo-pagans would love to say that, oh yeah, the Catholics showed up and St. Patrick threw all the pagans out or whatever, and then dawned this goddess, a saint, and made her Catholic. And I think that's a very oversimplified, like grossly oversimplified way of looking at it.
Yeah, I guess if you've got sort of like a literary basis for understanding the history of the saints rather than an oral basis, what you've got is that kind of, it doesn't change over time, right? Like as in the texts
exactly
that emerged from Ireland in, the 6th century AD when they started to kind of put things down on parchment. That's something that kind of has that infinite repeatability without necessarily changing. But also the oral traditions it is a kind of telephone game in terms of interpreting the texts that form part of that like canon around certain saints, because you have to either know Latin or Greek and be able to translate that and then interpret it out into others. And so there's this weird little space that develops between what's written down and what is understood by most of your lay, the laity, basically, lay practitioners of saint work. From my perspective,
Absolutely.
I've always had this big kind of affiliation with St. Michael. I was born Catholic, I was baptized, not confirmed, probably because I couldn't agree with anyone about who my patron saint should be. I wanted Stanislaw, just because he had a cool name. And everyone's like, no, you can't, you're not Polish, what the fuck? But but I'm like, it's great, he's got a wonderful name. But, from Sunday school and from sort of learning scripture, I always had this affiliation with St. Michael. And then it wasn't until, funnily enough, I joined Rune Soup that I understood the kind of the roots of St. Michael and the ways in which he kind of just showed up and
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of allowed himself to be made an archangel in a monotheistic sort of pantheon. That's fascinating, but I wouldn't have understood that by appealing to these original kind of texts because I didn't speak Greek or Latin. I had to wait for someone to give me the official line, the official story. This is the canonical kind of, this is how you should interpret St. Michael, not what I heard from the esoteric kind of sources, so to speak.
Well, and the other thing is that it's not canonical at all, but it's a far older story. You get into the books of Enoch, and then you see, like, so they talk about 4 archangels instead of the official 3. So they talk about how the 200 fallen angels that came to earth, and then the first angels who hear the outcry from mankind are Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. But you never hear about Uriel in the Roman Church. But if you crack open anything related to the Golden Dawn, now all of a sudden, oh, here's Uriel, the Archangel of the North. But yeah, they appear quite a lot actually in the Book of Enoch, which gets me into a whole other trip because that's a very interesting set of literature. And it's very powerful in its own way. Like, Europe had never seen the books of Enoch until, I believe it was James Bruce, who went to Ethiopia in the 1700s. You know, he was a Freemason, and his pseudo-official reason for going to Ethiopia was to look for the source of the Nile. But everybody knew where the source of the Nile was. I mean, yeah, it's in Ethiopia, but I suspect he was looking for the Ark of the Covenant there. But yeah, he looted Ethiopia for like 3 copies of the books of Enoch and a couple other books. And yeah, when he spent a lot of time there, and then when he took off, he had actually made his own copy of one of the oldest books of Enoch, and then took his own copy and then 2 of their old copies of actual physical books and took them back to Scotland with him. And, you know, and it's really interesting, too, that we've made the archangels saints, but nobody calls Abraham a saint or Noah. And then, you know, if you think about, you know, if you're going to go from the Bible, if you're going to kind of start with that and you're going to take it at face value, you know, everybody wants to call Adam and Eve our common ancestor, but if you read through toward, you know, the rest of Genesis and into Exodus, the earth was wiped clean. There was only 8 people on the ark. And so, you know, really Noah is our common ancestor.
But you get this division between prophets and saints, though. Like when you think about Moses and you think about Noah and you think about all the rest of the saints that pop up. I mean, some prophets are saints as far as I can recall, but not all prophets are saints, basically. There's this position that some sort of prominent people within the law sort of occupy, which is the intermediary point, sometimes between saints and the laity, and sometimes between God himself and the laity, you know, and that's that kind of prophetic function. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that it also comes back to, if a prophet has since died and if they start making miracles happening, then they're a saint. But, you know, maybe they just kind of went, peace out, you're on your own.
Yeah.
You know, which is also a completely reasonable reaction, I think, especially the way some prophets have been treated, that I can totally understand that reaction, honestly.
Well, it's just funny, like, you know, sometimes you'll have the saints and the angels talking to you and you're not considered a prophet. You'd be just considered to be mentally ill, particularly these days after Vatican II, when a lot of the mysticism was sort of drained out of the Catholic Church, much to its detriment, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And it also depends on it depends on like your parish. It depends on like the parish priest, if they're open to that, because there are still, they call them charismatic Catholics. There are still Catholics that have the gift of tongues or discerning tongues, visions, and I mean, like Saint Padre Pio, he had a lot of gifts. One of them was that he had the stigmata. And so, and he really, I can't remember. He's not actually that old compared to some other saints that have, like the apostles or anything like that. He's more of a modern saint. And so actually it's kind of funny. My godmother was a charismatic Catholic, and I couldn't have had it any other way. See, so I was kind of backwards. I was kind of more or less raised a pagan. My nanny was absolutely 100% like a feminist Wiccan.
Nice.
And
nice.
so, I grew up with the big black brick of the Golden Dawn, which was, Israel Regardie's class notes, basically. And back in the 70s and 80s, that was like the ultimate in, magical expression, really. And, that was along with books that were there wasn't that much available, and there certainly wasn't the embarrassment of riches that we have in terms of tarot decks that are available, and the amount of books that are available, and just the wonderful myriad of things that we have now, and along with all of these ancient texts that are being translated and republished for the first time in hundreds of years in some cases. So back then it was, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, Starhawk, I guess, the spiral dance, that was probably one of the first books that I actually read about sort of modern pagan practice. So that was kind of, where my head was at. So, laying on a blanket and sleeping out in the backyard and watching the stars was totally normal. And having invisible friends was like, it was something my family just totally took in stride. Like, whatever, okay, that's fine. And I have a lot of, now that I kind of see that in the rear view, I can kind of go, oh, like I have some other ideas about what that was and what that experience was. But yeah, I've been hearing voices and seeing things for my whole life. So I was 7 when my parents divorced. And so we moved from our homestead out in the country to Midtown. And it was quite a culture shock. Definitely not at all, what I had grown up with. And at the same time, my mother got involved with Scientology. And so that was super weird, because I actually spent grades 2 through 5 at a Scientology school. So I knew enough to kind of get the lingo and to be able to fit in well enough, but I was like the weird pagan kid in a sea of Scientologists, and they didn't really know what to do with me, because I was going to play the game to a certain point, but I had my limits, and I knew enough to, and the other thing that kind of scared them about me, and I've always been this way, was that I didn't care. I was fine advocating for myself, even with people who were 4 or 5 times my age. I didn't care. I mean, I wasn't disrespectful or anything, but I had no problem standing up for myself. So one of the things that was kind of interesting about moving to an urban setting was that for the first time, there were kids my age around. I had no kids my age around me. I spent a lot of time alone when I was a young kid. And so all of a sudden it was like, oh, there's all these people who are my age that, that I could hang out with. And so I made friends with a couple of girls who lived a block away from me, and their mom was from Honduras. And so they were being raised Catholic. So we always had sleepovers. I was always at their house. So if I stayed the night on a Saturday night, I ended up going to mass and catechism with them on Sunday mornings. So that was really my first introduction to saints. I remember the first time I went to mass with them, it was just, wow. I mean, it was such a place of power, the way that the light came in through the stained glass and the smell of incense and all the candles. I mean, banks and banks and banks of candles in front of statues and icons. And I mean, it was just beautiful, and just all your senses were overwhelmed. It was just the smells and the sounds and the music and all of these things. So, after you got through the liturgy of the word, all the school-age children were excused because they hadn't yet had their first communion. So, for the liturgy of the Eucharist, they were, you go off to go to catechism. So I was technically a year older than the kids when I would go to catechism with my best friend. But so the teacher, she was this really nice lady, and so she'd quiz everybody, a little, like who wrote, I don't know, whatever. She would, quiz you on books of the Bible or, just stuff that you would learn in catechism. And as a reward, you would get a prayer card. So I answered a question correctly. And so my first prayer card was St. Clara, or St. Clare, who was the contemporary of St. Francis of Assisi. And interestingly, she is the patron saint of television. The reason why they say that is that she was a nun. She took vows of chastity and poverty. And I can't remember if she was in ill health or if she had just been kind of like left in her cell. But she would have visions where she could watch the mass on the blank wall of her room, of her cell. And so she's also the patron saint of psychics, people who have any of the psychic gifts.
Like clairvoyance, for instance, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
An interesting secret with the
she's
names.
Got exactly. And so, the French would call her St. Clare. The Spanish would call her St. Clara. I mean, I live in her county. I live in Santa Clara County, which is kind of funny too. So I still have that prayer card. It's framed. It's in her own little niche. So that was kind of like my first experience with being introduced to the saints. But it was just kind of funny because I couldn't really continue with my best friend because I wasn't a baptized Catholic. So it wasn't like I could go have my first communion with her. And after the kids all had their first communion, it was just kind of funny, like their attendance at church kind of fell off a cliff. It was like, okay, we got what you came for. And I mean, they all got confirmed, but that was also close to me at the time.
Well, it's very much the thing that I remember about growing up sort of being baptized but not confirmed is that there was such a club atmosphere. It was like, oh, you're not in the club, you know what I mean? Like, if you're not going to take communion, then, what are you doing here? You have to pass this next threshold, which leads me to, I guess, a question around how non-Catholics engage with saints. We all sort of understand them, but there's got to be, like, I've had saints intercede on my behalf, although I'm not a full paid-up member of the club. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's using a specifically Catholic praxis to get in touch with them. I'll light a candle in a church, or I'll say a prayer, or I'll do a rosary or something like that. I'll do some prayers on a rosary for a particular saint, and they'll do it. And a lot of people, like, for instance, with St. Expedite, all flavors of religious denominations, and even non-Christians, will appeal to St. Expedite and have him intercede on their part. So you're seeing Hody everywhere, around the sort of forums, because he's come through with the goods. So, I mean,
For some people, he and I are not friends.
Right. Fair.
I mean, I've tried, but we are not friends. I've had some people kind of interpret that, and it's like, well, maybe, but yeah, and I mean, I would think that he's actually, Saint Expedite is more of a folk Catholic saint. He's not. I mean, like Diana Walsh Pasulka talks about this a little bit in some of her interviews, and in a couple of the two most recent books. She talks about the process of sainthood, just going, and it's the advocate and the investigator into whether or not somebody has the process in which that they're validated and made into a saint that's officially recognized is from a person called a postulator. And they're the person who is supposed to do all the investigations about, what are the miracles associated with this, individual spirit, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm not sure that anybody could really say that Expedite was an actual person. So that's why I don't think that he would never be canonized by the church. And I've heard some people say that if you're at all familiar with the African diaspora traditions, they would say that Expedite is actually the Gede, which are the forgotten dead. And I mean, like, that's the thing. It's like, really, anybody can engage with the saints. You don't have to be a member of the club. It doesn't hurt because, well, I can just put it bluntly, the agenda of almost every saint is going to, at least among the Catholic or Christian saints, is going to be to get your butt in a pew. So that's always going to be on their agenda. And, as long as you know that, you can still, you certainly don't have to, but it helps. And as long as you know that that's always going to be on their agenda, you can at least work with that. I mean, I'm sure that there's plenty of things that other people living and dead would like you to do. And they've got their agenda. And so you either go, yeah, that's a great idea, I'll do that, or not. So I had actually, I hadn't been in a church in years and years. And I had gone back into, just full pagan practice. So I had, I've identified as a Wiccan, I've identified as a pagan, as a polytheist, and all of the magical practice, all of the devotional practice that goes along with those labels. And I just got really disillusioned with that. I know that a few people have remarked on the material disparity between New Age people and people who identify as neo-pagans. And while that's not the end-all be-all measuring stick of success, in my opinion, it is interesting to note that that disparity is real, and that you go to something that's like anything that's New Age, you go to a New Age conference or some kind of lecture or workshop, the cars are going to be nicer. The clothes are going to be nicer, and I've been to a lot of pagan festivals and, conferences and things, and it's a big difference.
Well, the cars are almost always not there. You have to give someone a lift. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
But the other thing that was more important to me was that just about any standard you could apply, take health, for instance. I rarely ran across somebody in pagan circles that didn't have chronic disease. Almost everybody I knew had something wrong with them physically. And the thing that, and it kind of goes back to, I'm probably misquoting scripture, but, ye will know them by their fruits. I just kind of thought to myself, like, well, I don't want to be broke and sick. And if that is what this practice is going to get me, I really don't want to be involved in this. And the problem that I kind of had was I liked the spirits just fine. I had plenty of great experience, personal experiences and personal relationships with all of these spirits that, were pre-Christian. And I still struggle with that disparity, but I became really disillusioned. And that was about the time I moved to San Francisco, and I really couldn't find, people to connect with. And so I was just there by myself. And I met my ex-husband, who is Filipino, and he was absolutely a devout Catholic. And so I started going to mass with him. And it was fascinating because I think every cultural group has their own expressions of, even something as like Catholicism. The liturgy is basically the same anywhere you go. It's supposed to be. But there's little differences. There's little differences even at individual churches, depending upon, who, everybody's got a different vibe. So the interesting thing was at the time, all of the priests there were Filipino, and the head pastor was Monsignor Bitanga, and he was just such a warm, fun priest, for instance. And then he kept a lot of things that were old. So he offered a sung Latin mass every Sunday. So it was like high mass, it was at noon, and he sang the entire liturgy in Latin. Talk about just your hairs. I still get my hair stand up on end when I think about it. It was just so powerful. And what was nice was that you could actually follow along and do all of the responses in Latin as well, because they put out a special book with the entire liturgy in it, and they had Latin and then they had English on the other side. So yeah, I just started going back. And so when we decided to get married, I went through RCIA classes, which is basically a year-long, it stands for Rite of Christian Initiation for adults. That's what the A is. So, it was funny because my godparents were also, my godmother was this white as paper Irish lady, and her husband, my godfather, was this Filipino guy from, Ilocano, I guess, but and so they were my godparents. He was also a deacon. And it was funny because I ended up getting into the University of San Francisco, which is a Jesuit university. It's one of the 3 Jesuit universities in California. And so when I was going there for my undergraduate degree, I would run into him in the student union all the time because he was getting his master's degree in theology as part of his diaconate training. So, but yeah, so, it all culminates on Easter Vigil, which is the most beautiful ritual in the whole Catholic calendar. And it's got some of the oldest, it's probably very old. It's probably from the very beginnings of Christianity, the liturgy. And, then there's tons of readings from the Old Testament. They read right out of Genesis. And then at the end, they baptize and confirm, and you receive Holy Communion all on one night. And so that's a very intense initiation, because that's stuff that people normally space out over 13 years. Yeah. I think 13, 14 is when most kids get confirmed.
Yeah, 13. over here.
Yeah.
Usually. Yeah.
And so, yeah, you're getting 13 years worth of initiations all at once. And and then here's the other story, is that I really thought that Saint Bernadette, now Saint Bernadette, she became a saint after she saw an apparition of Mary over a series of days. And Mary, the Mother of God, basically told her to scratch at this part of a rock or like some dirt on the ground, and told her to wash herself and drink of this spring. And so Saint Bernadette was like, there's no water here, but she did as Our Lady asked, and out gushed forth this spring, and that's at Lourdes. That's the spring at Lourdes. So, I mean, pilgrims go there all the time. You can actually get the water. My mother-in-law gives me the bottles of water from Lourdes all the time. But yes, it's said to have healing properties. So I had really thought that I was going to take Saint Bernadette as my matron saint, I guess, at baptism. So my godparents had told me that, and I'm not sure if it's just that particular parish at the time, or if it's a little more global than that, but they were really stressing that you take a saint name for your baptism and that you take a saint name for your confirmation. And that they were saying, like, put a lot of thought into this because it's really important. So I really thought that I was going to go with Saint Bernadette. And in fact, as a gift, my stepmother had given me a rosary that the centerpiece had on the back of it a vial filled with Lourdes water. And on the front of it, it had a picture of Saint Bernadette praying in front of Our Lady at the grotto. But at the last minute, it was Saint Mary Magdalene that came through and was like, no, I'm your matron saint. So, and then because I had known him, and I just laughed because you had said in the beginning, you had talked about Saint Michael. Saint Michael the Archangel is my confirmation saint.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, good old Michael.
He's wonderful.
Well, it's more in terms of, I guess with the saints, right? Like, they allow you to have this more human relationship with the divine. So it's like a step, because they're, like Gordon Edwards Soup described in the Saints course, that the very special dead. I don't think that's his original quote, but he used it. That's how I remember it. So these people, for the most part, used to be living, and for the most part, used to be human. And so they allow you to have this kind of interface with the divine that is more human, in as much as there are some humans that you get along with, and there's some humans that don't, and there are some that will speak to you and some that won't. And even though Michael never had a body, whenever I say, the St. Michael prayer in Latin, which I say for my kids a lot, they're both really psychic. They have people coming in and they don't sleep. And so it's always St. Michael that clears that shit out just immediately. I mean, that and the Algol talisman that I keep in their room sometimes just to keep it very, very protected. But so Michael's always come through for me, and there's always been a lot of Michael syncs that would happen at particular moments when I required divine protection. And yet there are other saints that just I don't vibe with. And would you believe, Tonja, that I've never felt compelled to pray to St. Cyprian of Antioch, even as a magician, even though he's our patron saint, the patron saint of sorcerers. I've just never really felt compelled to engage with him yet. And he's just so big in esoteric circles, and St. Justina as well.
That's the thing that I find kind of funny, is that he got really popular there about 5 years ago, I guess, and 5-6 years ago, and all of a sudden he was everywhere. I find him extremely protective, but he hasn't really, my relationship with him is that he's there if I need him. And he's there even when I might be oblivious to my needing him, but he hasn't, like, I've talked to some other magicians who, have really had this really strong sort of apprentice master relationship with him, where he is very strongly directing their studies and, get this book and do this and that. He's been more hands off with me. He's been more like, you're okay, but I'm here if you've got questions. And that's the other thing, is that I think people sleep on Justina, and they really shouldn't, because, if you read the story, that, he was a very powerful magician, and just by crossing herself, she thwarted all of his efforts. And it's sort of like, okay, well, who's the real badass here?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's a lot of badass female saints that embody, the canonical saints, the female canonical saints will always embody appropriate behaviors that are expected of women within the church. And this is one of the critiques of Catholicism, right? Because you have, obviously, Mother Mary, St. Mary, Mother of God, who, is absolute compassion. I've prayed to Mary often. And, that's a wonderfully accepted kind of standard of female behavior within the church. But then you also have these badass female saints that somehow manage to just get in there with some behaviors that they're beatified for, that fall well outside what you would expect from moral behavior. I'm thinking of St. Teresa. I think it's St. Teresa of Avalon, who, let's face it, we've all seen the sculpture. She came so hard that she was made a saint. Like, come on, that's fantastic amounts of female power and female sexual power particularly. And the thing about Justina is, one cross, that's it. And there's this massive, massive well of, I guess, feminine power that's really highly, stringently contained within the hierarchies of canonical sainthood and within the church generally, that you don't necessarily find reflected in the full register of the ways in which the lives of the saints are communicated. The female saints in particular are always beatified, or they're always lionized for their gentility rather than their feats of anything else. I mean, how does that factor in for you, considering your context? Given, California in the 80s and 90s, that's like peak neo-pagan, peak New Age, peak strong feminist kind of messaging that the rest of us are still consuming. So how does that fit with you?
Yeah. And, I think it was, the late 60s, early 70s definitely started that, like, more women were sort of embodying the ideal of feminism. Because like you go back and you start reading like the early feminist writers. I'm not talking about like first wave that got us the vote, although they're interesting as well, and they have a lot of the same complaints. But you start reading like the feminine mystique. Well, who was reading that? Housewives in the late 50s, and they're all cracked out on Valium because their lives are so unfulfilling and so cloistered in so many ways that really that was the only option. And and really in Saint Teresa of Avila or even Saint Clare, really the only options for women have ever been get married and have children and then die.
No, true, fair point.
And so part of me wonders, like, how much of that is just Roman Empire stuff? Because, you even go back to pre-Christian, like the Vestal Virgins. They came from rich families, rich patrician families. And then, they got, they went and basically stayed in a separate household with other women, and they had so many more privileges than just regular women had. But, they, for instance, they were just paraded around the city, and they had, they could go to games at the Coliseum, and they just had all these privileges. But at the same time, they were to, adhere to strict chastity, because that is absolutely who Hestia/Vesta was. But, at the end of service, after 20 years of being I can't remember if it was 20 years or 30 years, at the end of that, your father, if he's still alive, is still going to use you as a pawn in having the best marriage for political and economic reasons that he can get. Granted, you're probably too old for having children at that point, but, who knows? Maybe you could just be a cool second wife, whatever, So, Catholicism kind of offered another thing. I mean, like Teresa of Avila is a great example, and St. Clara is another great example. They both came from wealthy families. And so their two options were, your dad is going to basically make the best political maneuver he can by marrying you off to some family that's going to be, good for him, or in the case of St. Clara, you run away from home and join a convent. And like, even then, like her family kept trying to talk her into, coming home, and she just was so devout to Jesus that she refused all of her family's attempts to bring her home. And in fact, I think her sister even went with her. One or two of her sisters went with her. So yeah, I mean, it was sort of like, do you want to have these ecstatic visions of God and, live this life of, at least where you'd be able to read and write and all of these things? Or do you want to end up in a potentially loveless marriage, and you never know, is your husband going to be abusive? Is he going to be a womanizer? How does that all go? And it's not like there was anybody out there advocating against domestic violence or anything back then. So you just hope that your father chose good for you, chose well. And, those were really your options. And that's what I watched. I think it was last year. I watched the movie that had Joaquin Phoenix in it as Jesus, and Mara is her last name. She was Mary Magdalene. And what I appreciated about that was that they didn't go with Pope Gregory's slanderous view of her, calling her a prostitute. They really depicted her as, like, the way that she was sinning was that she was not interested in marriage and motherhood. She didn't know she didn't know what she wanted to do, but she knew that she wasn't going to be happy doing what, her sisters and the rest of her family were doing. And so, it was amazing how, they even depicted, they were trying to perform an exorcism on her, and they almost drowned her in the movie, at least. It was only at the last minute when her father showed her mercy that, she was able to escape that. So, really that was the alternative, was that you'd be called a whore if you weren't safely ensconced in married life.
Yeah, there's obvious massive problems with that, and there's obvious kind of structural continuity to a lot of that oppression that still exists in the church today. But the church does offer the Catholic Church in particular does offer this wonderful kind of third category of experience for people who adhere to it, which is sanctuary. And so in a funny way, you get this kind of sanctuary from oppressive married life in the form of convents, in the form of religious communities and orders, which work just as well for men as for women. They were probably quite...
Oh yeah, monasteries were great.
Oh, hotbeds of homosexuality too, if you read the history right, as well, which is, how can I escape? I can just go and become a monk and join a religious order. But also, like, in terms of saint work and in terms of working with the saints, there's still that kind of, I wouldn't call it mercy, but I'd call it some sort of spiritual sanctuary that you can get from contacting and working with these people. The saints that kind of are there for you to work with will offer you that sense of I guess, compassionate intervention and intercession on your behalf. And I'm wondering, for yourself, like today, how do you work with saints at the moment? Like, what's the bulk of your work with saints right now?
I I'll tell you a story. So my husband and I owned a house in Sunnyvale, and that's when I started going, like, so I hadn't been in church for a number of years. So like after my ex and I broke up, I had been going to Mass. I continued to go to Mass, but at the same time, there was a lot of things that I was having a hard time squaring. And I had talked to my priest about it. At this point in time, I had also changed churches. I was going to a church that was closer to my apartment. And I had talked to him, and, I told him what had happened, that, my ex had left and that we were in the middle of getting divorced. And, what does that do to my standing in the church? And what do I got to do? And so I had a really hard time sort of squaring what I would have to claim in order to be eligible for an annulment. But on top of that, I would have to pay something like $500 for the privilege. And I kind of felt like I would have to lie in order to have that annulled. So it really left a bad taste in my mouth. Now, I'm the last person who's going to be an apologist for the Roman Church. Have they done horrific things? Absolutely. So I kind of just let it go. And I thought and I was like, you know what, I'm not gonna perjure myself just so that I can, be quote unquote in good standing. At the same time, I kind of thought, if my ex feels like reframing whatever happened in whatever way, go for it, but I didn't want to lie. So I found myself just kind of backing away into the point where I just wasn't going to Mass anymore. And I had another experience, and it was kind of funny too, because at the time, like, I had just gone like hardcore Catholic. Like, I had boxed up all of my magical tools, everything, and they had just gone up in the closet, and I hadn't touched them in years. But when we were in the process of breaking up, I was praying to Mother Mary so much, and rosary after rosary and prayer after prayer. And the silence was deafening. The phone line was dead. And so I really felt like super lost at that point in time. Different spirits came back to me. So I just kind of washed my hands of it and went back to full polytheistic pagan practice. I left the lines open, so to speak, but for whatever reason, like, obviously, like, that relationship was in transition, and I wasn't getting any feedback. So I just kind of went, well, I don't know if this is permanent. I don't know if this is temporary. It's too bad, but I'm going to go where I'm wanted. So anyways, back to this house. So this is many years later. I meet my second husband, and we bought this great house in Sunnyvale. And then I had joined Rune Soup back in, I want to say, late 2017. They were just finishing up the grimoire course when I joined. So because I wasn't able to start from the beginning, like to go through the class live with everybody else, I kind of hung back. And so I used that time to basically devour all of Gordon's books, as many blog posts as I could find, to listen to the entire back catalog of the podcast. And so the next course that started was the Saints course. And so I went on that journey and met Saint Cyprian. And I was like, Cyprian, why do I know that name? And the reason why I knew that name is because St. Cyprian's was in my neighborhood. And I had driven by it a couple of times. And I was going like, oh, okay. So I really wanted to get holy water from his church. And then I was like, you know what, maybe I'll go to. So what I did is I went to a Saturday night vigil mass, sat in the back with all the widows. And it was so comforting. And I had immediate rapport. He was like excited that I was at mass. And it was like, okay, well, it's not a big deal. Just don't strike me with lightning or anything, Yahweh. It's cool. So I had been going there for, I don't know. I mean, we only lived in that house for like 2.5 years. So I was going to mass regularly, but it was the same thing. I really didn't get that involved. I just sat in the back, and Saturday night vigil mass was pretty sparsely attended. It was also really funny because I was sitting back there one night, and I got there early because I wanted to light a candle and pray. And this one gentleman came over and sat down next to me and started talking to me about the rosary. And he was a member of what's called the Legion of Mary. So he asked me how many people were in my household, and I was like, just 2. And so he gave me 2 ring rosaries, and he gave me like this little slip of paper that had, I don't know if you're familiar with the Fatima prayer. It's usually said after the Glory Be when you come to the end of a decade. You're asking Jesus to forgive sinners, especially those in most need of thy mercy, is how it finishes. And I was like, that's cool. I like that. So I was carrying around this ring rosary in my wallet all the time, and I took the other one home and put it on my altar. And so I kind of was like tentatively like, maybe Mary is going to talk to me again. Maybe this was a sign that she's ready to talk to me again. And that was exactly what it was, is that it was her way of saying like, why don't you give me a call again, and we'll start talking again. So I started praying the rosary again. And then, so after a while, this was a couple of years later. So my husband and I were doing some like updating to the house because we were getting ready to sell it. And it was very much a fixer-upper when we first moved there. So we did a lot of work on that house. And so we just knew that we needed to do a couple other things and that we were going to get ready to sell. And we had a lot of optimism, because the first thing is that Apple Computer had just built their big, what they call the spaceship, their big, huge, like new campus was just like less than 5 miles from our house. So we were like, yes, we're going to sell our house to somebody with lots of stock options. And we were just we were ready to get out of there. But the other part of it is that even when we first got together, we knew that we always wanted to move to Campbell. And I don't know why, we just both loved the place. We hadn't even spent that much time here, but there was just something about it that was just huge pull that was like, we need to move there. That's where we need to be. When we first got together, we just didn't have the money to move here. And it's not like it's an especially expensive place compared to other places in the Bay Area. It was just the places that we saw were older and needed a lot of work. And we just knew like, God, we have to buy and sell a couple houses in order to get enough money to move here. So we were like, well, this might be our shot. If we get enough for this place, we can probably move to Campbell. So one night we had finished like doing the flooring. We put in new carpet. We totally updated the whole kitchen, put new appliances in. So we had already kind of started peeking at like, where would we want to live in Campbell? And so I started just going like, well, how am I going to, which saints should I ask for help with? Because there's the old tradition of, burying Saint Joseph, burying his statue upside down in your yard to sell your house, which kind of seems kind of rude. and I was kind of like, well, that's not exactly what my problem is, because like, really, if you dig down into that particular ritual or tradition, it's really if you're having a hard time selling your house. And I knew we weren't going to have like a hard time selling the house. And so it would be premature to even do that, because that's very compelling and kind of rude. So I didn't need to like pressure St. Joseph into doing anything for me. So I was kind of like, well, I need to figure out I wonder if there's like a patron saint of Campbell, or like, who are the patron saints of the Catholic churches in Campbell that I can go and maybe petition. So it was St. Lucy and St. Christopher were the two saints that have churches in the city of Campbell. So I was kind of like, well, Lucy's cool. I'm friends with Lucy. She's the patron saint of eyesight. You'll see her iconography usually shows her eyeballs on a tray. They had plucked her eyeballs out of her head when she was being tortured before she was murdered. So yes, she's the patron saint of like blind people and eye problems, eyesight, things like that. And then there's St. Christopher. Well, St. Christopher has a long and interesting history. And in fact, he's another one of these saints who have a long, long tradition behind them, but maybe wasn't actually a real person. He's also been syncretized to Hermanubis, who is an Alexandrian god who is a mix of Anubis from Egypt and Hermes from the Greek. And so he's right along in there with Serapis as far as these syncretic gods of Alexandria. And in some texts, like if you read his story in the Golden Legend, he is described as having a dog's head. And even on old maps and things like that, they talk about St. Christopher sometimes having the appearance of a dog or having a dog's head. And that I can't remember what story I had read it in, where they were saying that there were these canine-headed race of people where St. Christopher was from, and supposedly they were cannibals and all kinds of horrible things. So I thought, oh, St. Christopher, this is really kind of cool, because I had already worked a great deal with Hermanubis, as far as I had worked with him for both some ancestor work, but also for some divinatory, like scrying work, scrying into bowls of wine. This is all stuff that comes out of the PGM, I believe. So I thought, St. Christopher, well, that's closer to where I want to live in Campbell. So maybe I'll hit him up. So we got into we started getting ready to sell the house. And so one night I petitioned both Cyprian and Christopher. And I both, nicely, of course, but in ceremony had told both of them, look, this is what is happening. I am going to leave Sunnyvale. We're selling this house, whether you like it or not, and we're moving to Campbell. And I'm probably going to end up at St. Christopher's Church. So you two, please work it out. I'm not in the middle of this. You guys need to work it out. So we sold that house for a huge profit. I mean, it was more than even our realtor thought we were going to get. So now we had the money. And the nice thing is I've only been recently horrified by how owning a home in the Commonwealth countries, it seems so volatile to me compared to like how that works here. I just kind of go, oh my gosh, how does anybody buy a house? It seems like it's they change the goalposts all the time. So it was super interesting because we did a deal where when we sold the house, what we asked for was, not only way above our asking price, but we asked for 90 days of what's called rent back, where you are allowed for 90 days to continue to live in your house rent free while you look for your next house. It's a common, at least in the Bay Area, that's a very common concession, just because buying and selling of houses around here happens so fast and it can be so difficult because, with the amount of tech millionaires around here that people can easily, there's been a lot of times when people come in with all cash and they just ace everybody out. And so, I know that there's been a lot of people that have, lost multiple homes in, just because they didn't come in with all cash. So we were still staying at the house and we were going to like every open house trying to look for a place. So my husband spots this odd open house because it's like open on a Thursday or something, like a Thursday or a Wednesday, which is just really unusual. Most open houses are on the weekend when most people are, off work and they have free time. I came to the open house by myself and I was absolutely in love with this place. I was like, yes, this is it. This is the house. So we wrote the seller like this really nice letter and I got a few, just listening to her agent talk and stuff like that. I got a few ideas. And so we wrote her a nice letter and put in an offer. And lo and behold, we had the highest offer and she liked our letter the best. And so we got the house. Only we had to give her, a 3-month rent back because she was moving out of state. So now it was like, great, we have the house. We've signed all the paperwork. Everything is taken care of. It's our house, but we can't move in. So I'm scrambling to find us someplace to stay. Not only that, I have a 92-pound dog. So staying like in an extended stay hotel wasn't going to really work. So I'm looking for like an Airbnb that we can stay in for a couple of months while we're waiting for her to clear out and move to Washington. And then like her agent was kind of telling us, oh, she might leave earlier because she already owns her house up in Washington State. So, maybe she'll leave earlier or whatever. Oh no, she waited until the very last day. So I got a post office box down here. And so I was just kind of driving around, checking things out. I drove by St. Christopher's Church and I'm like, oh, okay, this is where I'm going to go to church. So I ended up I kept getting declined from all of these Airbnbs. And I kind of guess it was probably because of the really long stay that I was asking for. I was like, yeah, we need to stay for 6 to 8 weeks because we're not sure when this lady's leaving. And so everybody kept declining us. And then I found on Vrbo this one cottage way, way south. It was this really nice Indian family. They had this cottage on their property. Their property was probably 3 acres. They were just turning it into paradise. It was amazing. They had just fruit trees everywhere. We drive up, there's deer everywhere. Oh my God, it was amazing. Anyways, we finally move into the house and I did all kinds of stuff. So for instance, I did a litany of the saints as I circumambulated the entire property, just to kind of bless it and protect it and clear it out and call on all the help of all these saints. And that's a really easy way to just introduce yourself to a lot of saints. If you're not used to saint work at all, because like you said, you don't know who you're going to get along with. You're not going to know who you vibe with. And so the litany of the saints. I mean, there's plenty of music. You can even, pull it up on YouTube and just listen to it. And there's dozens and dozens of saints in the litany. I really enjoy, Gordon's recommendation to kind of make it your own and take out saints that maybe you don't gel with and then add ones that you do. So here's the funny thing. We had lived here for, I don't know, a month or so. And I'm talking to my mother-in-law. And so she asked me, she's like, oh, well, which church did you decide to go to? And I was like, oh, St. Christopher's. That's where I've been going. And she says, that's where your husband was baptized.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And he didn't even know.
Oh, really?
So,
oh, that's fantastic.
He didn't, I don't even think he knew. He was like, oh, really?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's funny because but I go alone. He doesn't go with me. There's one time a year he will go with me. But yeah, people ask me, they're like, wait, your offering envelope say, you're wearing a wedding ring, how come it's just you? And I said, I'm just here representing the team. I'm like, he doesn't have to come.
Yeah,
it's up to him. But yeah, I mean, and there's so much fun little things like that happen. But like, for instance, but there's definitely saints that don't like me and I don't really like them. And there are saints that like I'm acquainted with, but I don't, it's like, you show up to a cocktail party and you see that guy and it's just kind of like, hey, and you kind of,
there's tens of thousands of them. Yeah. Look, there's so many saints, someone you're going to get along with, right?
Absolutely.
And, the ones that kind of aren't that into you, it's not like they're just being terrible or bitchy or, being assholes or what have you. I mean, it's probably just that you've got to accept that these are, by definition, spiritually elevated beings, and they will have their own reasons for sticking with certain people and not working with other people. And,
yes,
that human relationship is kind of, it's two-sided. It goes both ways, because if they used to have a body, if they used to be human, then they're going to be able to kind of manage that sort of interpersonal thing with you a little bit better.
It's my strong opinion that even if they weren't, I mean, like, I think all spirits are like that. They're going to get along with some people better than others, and they're not going to like other people. In my experience, even if a saint doesn't like you, they're probably not going to actively try to harm you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They're just not that into you. I mean, like other classes of spirits, that doesn't necessarily apply to you, but this is my own axe to grind, but I have a real problem with spiritual practitioners who sell introductions to spirits.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Even if you are getting other things, like let's say rituals or songs they have written, or other forms of materia that you get for your fee, in the end, what it looks like to me is a matchmaker, a spiritual matchmaker. They're providing an introduction to a spirit. And sometimes it's for a massive amount of money. I mean, I've seen what amounts to a spirit introduction for well over $1,000. And to me, I just kind of go, well, yeah, I mean, those are original rituals that you have written, or songs or hymns or anything like that, prayers, which great, are probably, worth something. But at the same time, you cannot guarantee that spirit is going to like all of your quote unquote students. And it's unnecessary. You can introduce yourself to saints. You can introduce yourself to spirits. Just don't show up empty-handed. Show up with some flowers, show up with some water, a glass of wine, some, I don't know, some rice or some food, and just, hi, I am attracted to you. I like you, let's be friends. Or
Well,
let's
it's
talk.
like introducing yourself to someone at a party. You just go up and sort of say, hey, can I get you a drink? Something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's good
not
advice.
all of them are going to be interested in the same kinds of offerings. Water is almost universally appreciated, I have found. Incense is universally appreciated.
Oh, yeah.
Booze, some spirits might not be that into it. Some saints are definitely not that into it.
You probably wouldn't want to offer Mother Mary whiskey or anything like that.
No, and Saint Anthony either. Saint Anthony doesn't want anything sexy. He's very shy. He's very temperate, and you don't want to offer him alcohol or.
Isn't it recommended some sort of bread for St. Anthony? He takes bread or something like that.
Bread would be a good one, but really, a lot of the time, a lot of saints, they would be more happy if you did something for the poor, or you did something nice for the elderly, or something like that. I mean, they're like, well, it's great that you brought me all this stuff, but you'd make me a lot happier if you even just helped a little old lady cross the street or something.
Yeah. That's the thing. These are godly entities. You know what I mean? These are spiritually elevated entities. They're going to. It's just different. Yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah. Absolutely.
Probably a good place to tell people about the services that you offer, Tonja. So, how can people get in touch with you? How can people kind of learn more about your work, and how can people kind of connect? Because this has been like a fantastic discussion about your personal experience with the saints, right? And your personal work and the ways in which you've come to, I think, a plethora of spiritual entities and a huge world of spiritual praxis that people may not be aware of. Either, if they're Christian or non-Christian, or if they're Catholic or non-Catholic, like the world of the saints and saint work is gigantic and fascinating and just deeply complex and subtle and nuanced. And so if people want to kind of find out more and sort of maybe engage with you or with the kinds of products and services that you offer, where can they go? How can they do it?
So the first place they could find myself would be at inspiringliberation.com. I sometimes blog there. I've got a few things in the hopper, so to speak, getting ready to go. I'm so bad about writing. It's probably the same. I was thinking about this the other day, and it's probably the same thing with why I don't take photographs very much, because I find that it takes a certain bit of dissociation or detachment in order to photograph something or to journal about something and to blog about something. If I'm immersed in what I'm doing and into the experience, I'm not thinking about, how can I take this shot, or how can I, write about this. And so I've been kind of deeply in my own practice and in my own research about things. It's kind of funny. My interest in ancient Ethiopia has been rekindled, partly because actually at Gordon's recommendation, I started praying daily to Prester John, who shows up in medieval documents. He wrote a letter to the Pope. I think it was Pope Clement at the time, but it might be somebody else. They're talking about all of these, that they're a Christian nation and that he's priest and king, and it's where the waters of paradise flow. And So I was like, I've got this prayer. And so I was, I just thought this is a neat guy. I don't know if he's like a folk saint, is he some kind of spirit? I don't really know, but I'm really intrigued. And so in my research on Ethiopia, I was shocked, and I took it as a good sign, a kind of wink from the universe that his name pops up again. So yeah, I've been really, elbow deep into some research on that line. And I hope to write about that when I get a little more done. But yeah, anyways, that's inspiringliberation.com. And I blog there. There are links to my Etsy site. I honestly don't know how much longer I'm going to keep my Etsy shop, but for now I do sell some oils for St. Cyprian. They're actually based on Conjurman Ali's recipes. So I offer all 3 of those. I've got some other odds and ends in there. I sold a lot of inventory over the holidays. So there's just a few things left. I'm sort of been thinking about how to move potentially into having my own website and store instead of doing my sales through Etsy. But that's where you can find me. Unless you're a Rune Soup member, you can occasionally find me on the Ansible, but I'm not there that often anymore.
Fair. Well, look, I'll be linking to your site and also your Etsy store in the show notes. And if it changes, I'll just update the show notes in future so people can find you.
Sure,
I use your angelic psychic vision oil a lot, and I can vouch for its efficacy. So guys, make sure you check it out and nab some of those items before they're all gone. But look, Tonja, thanks for dropping by today. This was a fascinating discussion and a really great insight into a type of praxis that most people may not be 100% familiar with. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing your story.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. This was super fun.